Guten Tag, mein Name ist Clara Maviglia und ich leite das
Hello, I'm
Institut
Clara
für Cultural
Mavelia,
Entrepreneurship.
and I set
Heute
up
ist
the
Andreas
Institute for
Gebhard mein
Cultural
Gast. Wir
Entrepreneurship.
sind in Berlin,
Today, my
wo er
guest
die
is
beliebte
Andreas
Konferenz
Gebhard. We're in
Republica
Berlin,
veranstaltet.
where the
Willkommen,
popular
Herr
conference
Gebhard.
Republica is taking place.
Guten Tag, Herr
Welcome to
Gebhard.
Mr. Gebhard.
Sie sind sehr bekannt und
Hello,
insbesondere
Mr.
Ihre Konferenz
Gebhard.
Republica ist sehr
You're
beliebt.
a well-known
Wie
person, and
erklären
especially
Sie
your
das?
conference
Ja, hallo,
Republica
erstmal
is well
hier.
known. Why?
Ja, wie erkläre ich mir
Yes,
das? Weil es
welcome
schon viele Jahre gibt.
to
Wir machen das
our
jetzt schon
home.
seit 2007, also
Well, I
dieses Jahr
suppose
zum
we've been
8. Mal.
around for quite a few years. We started in
Klein angefangen, das heißt,
2007, so
über
it's the
4
eighth
Jahre
time we're holding
eine
Republica.
Community
We began
aufbauen
small.
können. Das heißt also, Leute haben sich
We
begeistert
developed a
können für die erste
community,
Veranstaltung, die wir gemacht haben damals.
people who
Und
were
haben dann
enthusiastic
eigentlich Schritt
about
für
the
Schritt immer
first
Freunde,
event we
Bekannte,
held,
Geschäftspartner
and
mitgebracht.
gradually
Und
we've
so
picked
konnte
up
das
more
halt immer größer werden.
friends,
Das heißt, wir sind also in einer
more business
Situation,
partners, and
dass
we've
wir
grown
einerseits
bit by
spannende
bit.
Themen aus der digitalen Welt präsentieren,
We have
also
some
Vorträge,
fascinating
Diskussionen
themes from the
mit
digital world, with
Präsentationen,
lectures,
mit
discussions,
Ausstellungsständen
presentations,
etc. Und auf der anderen
exhibition
Seite sehr, sehr viele
stalls,
spannende Leute haben, die halt auch dorthin kommen zum
but
Austausch.
also
Das heißt
really
also
interesting
in der Lage,
people
eigentlich
who
einerseits
come and
neue
exchange
Inhalte
views.
kennenzulernen oder vertiefende Inhalte
Some
kennenzulernen.
people
Auf der anderen
come to
Seite neue
find
Menschen
out
kennenzulernen
about things or
und
to find out
das
more
halt
about things, but
und
also
das
to
vielleicht
get to know new people.
zu sagen, es gibt halt
And I
eine
suppose that's the
Community
key to
und
our
ein
success,
ausgewogenes
that we
Programm,
can
das
say there's a
die Community
community
bietet.
and that we have a well-balanced
Aber machen
program.
Sie dabei was Besonderes im Umgang mit den Menschen?
But is there anything special
Ja,
you do
also
in the
wir
way
denken
you
immer,
attract people?
auf Augenhöhe zu diskutieren ist wichtig, das ist das eine. Das
Well,
heißt,
we always
sowohl der
think it's
politische
important for
Aktivist als
people
auch
to
der
speak as peers, as
CEO
equals. Political
soll
activists,
willkommen sein,
CEOs of
genauso wie
listed
Journalisten
companies
und
are all welcome,
Internetaktivisten
as
oder
are
Künstler. Also
journalists,
es ist eine sehr breite
internet
Gruppe von Leuten, die
activists,
zu uns kommen.
artists. So it's a very
Auf der
broad
anderen
spectrum of
Seite,
people who come
wir
to
als
us.
Veranstalter haben uns von Anfang
At
an
the same
gedacht, dass wir
time,
eine
as
Veranstaltung organisieren wollen, auf die wir auch
organisers,
selber gehen
we've
wollen. Das
always
heißt also
felt
eben die Sachen
that we
abschalten
want
und
to
nicht
organize an
machen,
event that
die
we'd like to go to
Veranstaltung
ourselves and
doof
not just
finden.
switch off.
Und, ja, so haben wir über die Jahre das immer weiterentwickelt.
We don't want to be
dass
responsible for
einerseits
something we
Inhalte so
don't
spannend sind,
like.
dass sie uns auch immer selber überzeugen.
And I
Und
suppose
da
that's
wirklich
why
nichts nach
the
Vorschrift
content is
besteht, dass man
always
also
so
sagt, wir
exciting.
machen das jetzt
It's
einfach mal,
not
sondern wir geben uns
that
auch
we
ein
sit
bisschen
there
Mühe.
like a job's worth and
Und
say, oh,
dass
we've
die
got to do it again
Aufenthaltsqualität
this
sehr hoch ist.
year.
Das heißt, es gibt viele
No, we give ourselves.
Rückzugsmöglichkeiten, es gibt immer wieder was
We
zu
take a lot of
entdecken.
trouble.
Mittlerweile
And
ist
there are
das
corners where
Gelände so
people
groß, dass
can
wir
sit back and talk or
dass wir eigentlich
rest.
für jeden
We
da
have
was
so
haben
much
in diesem
space
Jahr.
now
Es sind insgesamt
that
15
there's
Bühnen, auf denen
a
das
place for
Programm parallel
everybody.
stattfindet. Also es ist ein
We now
riesiges
have
Festival. Ich sage auch
15
ganz gerne, es ist
stages,
ein Business
rather like a
Festival,
festival.
nur Business im
It's a
klassischen
business festival, if
unternehmerischen
you
Sinne,
like.
sondern eben Leute kommen dahin, um ihre
Not business in the
Projekte, ihre
classical
Geschäfte zu
corporate
machen.
sense, but
Und
people
das
come
kann
along with
natürlich
their
auch ein
projects
journalistisches Projekt sein
and explain
oder
what they
ein
do.
technologisches Projekt sein. Das muss nicht unbedingt was mit
It could be
Unternehmertum zu tun haben.
technological,
Aber
it
so
could
diese beiden
be
Komponenten,
anything. It doesn't have to
Projektentwicklung und
be
Festivalcharakter,
about
machen wir
commercial
verschieden.
practice. But this,
Wir haben gesehen, dass bei
these
Ihren
two aspects
Konferenzen anders
account for
als die
our
meisten leider
specialness.
sind wirklich viele Referentinnen, also Female Speakers
There are a lot of
da.
speakers
Und das
and a
ist
lot of female speakers above all.
unglaubliches innovatives
That's quite
Potenzial, das
unusual,
Sie da
unfortunately.
dadurch entfalten.
There's tremendous innovative
Wie ist das
potential there
entstanden?
too.
Ja, verrückt eigentlich,
How
dass
did
es
that
ein
come
innovatives
about?
Potenzial ist, weil
Yes, crazy,
müsste
isn't
ja
it,
eigentlich
that
ein
it's
Normalfall sein.
innovative
Für
to
uns
talk
ist
about having female
einerseits
speakers. It
als
should be
diese
normal, shouldn't
jüngere
it?
Generation von Konferenzorganisatoren eigentlich
I suppose
selbstverständlich, dass
we're talking
so
about a younger generation of
unser
conference
Programmteam
organisers.
besteht
To
eigentlich
us, it's
hauptsächlich aus Frauen. Wir haben
self-evident.
schon immer da einen großen Wert drauf gelegt.
In fact, our program
dass das
team
Programm
are
einfach so
mostly
gestaltet
women,
ist, dass
and
es
we
bunt
attach
gemischt
great
ist, dass halt,
importance
für
to
alle was dabei ist.
having
Und,
this great
das ist nicht
diversity in
nur
our
im
program, so
Programm
that
so,
there's
sondern
something
auch
for
bei
everyone.
Teilnehmerinnen haben wir
That's
fast
not just
50-50
for the
ist,
program,
was halt für
it
eine
also
technologisch
applies to the
orientierte Konferenz
participation. It's more or less
ja, relativ auswendig ist,
50-50,
also
which for a
ungewöhnlich ist,
technological
weil,
conference
weil
is
sonst
quite
halt eher ein
unusual,
kleinerer Kreis
because
von auch nur
otherwise
interessierten Leuten vielleicht
you tend to
Interesse hätte.
get
Hier ist es so, dass
in this
wir
rather
durch die
smaller
Breite, wir
circle
sprechen ja von der
of
digitalen
technological
Gesellschaft insgesamt,
experts,
auch immer
not
viele
so much the
Themen
case,
haben,
but
die
we're
halt
talking about digital
alle
society.
interessieren.
So we have a lot of themes
Auch das
here
passiert nicht
which
von heute auf morgen,
interest
da muss man
all
über Jahre
genders.
lernen und das
And of course, it
ausbauen.
doesn't
Da
happen
haben wir einen
overnight.
sehr guten
You have to get to
Schwerpunkt.
know
Und
each
wenn man
other,
guckt,
you have to build on it.
was so der Altersdurchschnitt der Sprecherinnen
But if
bei
we
uns
look
ist,
to
ist es auch
see at
ziemlich jung.
the
Also
average
Projekte,
age of our
gestartet halt
participants,
vielleicht
they're
in
pretty
den
young as
20er oder
well.
in den 30er Jahren,
People who've started
also
up
vom Alter her
projects
und
when they
dadurch
were
halt
in their
eben
20s or
ja,
30s.
auch frische, neue Inhalte und
So there's a lot of
Frauen
freshness, a
und
lot
Männer
of new
genauso,
content
die
and a
halt
lot of
eben
young
ja,
women
eine
and young
Generation
men too.
Einläuten und
So maybe it's a shift in generation that
Ja,
we're
toll.
heralding. And we think it's fantastic.
Eine Frage jetzt zu Ihnen
Yes, it
persönlich,
is.
für Leute, die vielleicht
Question
werden
on
wollen.
you personally, for
Was
people
war
who
entscheidend
perhaps
für
would
Sie,
like to be like you.
zu kommen, wo
What was
Sie
decisive
Naja,
in
gut, erstmal
getting you
dieses
where you
Alter,
are now?
habe ich ja schon erreicht. Ich
I
bin
suppose a
jetzt
certain
38.
age.
I'm
38 now.
Geschichte ist ein bisschen geprägt aus 2, 3 verschiedenen Phasen. Ich habe lange Politik gemacht.
My story was influenced, I suppose, by various different phases. I was a politician for a long time for the Green Party. I started from scratch, did local politics, worked at the interface between our citizens, our voters, and the political structure and the administration. Then I stopped doing that and moved into entrepreneurial activity, not because I particularly wanted to be an entrepreneur, but because I didn't have a job at the time. And I thought, okay, I'd better create one for myself. And then it took time. Of course, over time you develop contacts and ideas, and if you have substantive foundations, you can build on them. Even if you make mistakes, you can learn from things, but if you don't experience that as a setback, but say, I'm going to learn, then you can develop a framework. And for me, it was open source technology. That is software that doesn't cost you anything, and the internet. And there's so much happening there, including with entrepreneurship. There's nothing ready-made about it. It's changing all the time. So there are always new projects and people doing things. But you need to have a certain obstinacy, a certain endurance. Not everyone who's unemployed would hit upon the idea of becoming an entrepreneur. No, of course, but I don't know why not. It's just a social habit, really. Of course, you have to be prepared to take a bit of risk. We began at the time with no money, no resources. But it's not really the prerogative of a certain age range or a certain group of people. You just shouldn't sit there waiting. It's, make the contribution. You've got an idea, do something about it. If you're value-driven, then you can make things happen. And you can enjoy it. It can be a very satisfactory working life, especially working with other people that you get on with. It's not just about earning money, it's about the content. Do you have a personal philosophy in life? Is that part of your philosophy? Personal philosophy in life, I don't know. That's a huge Pandora's box. I do like to link things I enjoy doing with things that are meaningful. And we have this open source issue, which I mentioned, which I suppose is a kind of envelope. But it has to work. You need to earn a bit of money. And you shouldn't have too many worries. If you look at this interface between the human being and the technology or the machine, I would always argue that you need to make sure that we aren't guided entirely by the machines, by the technology, but keep our eyes open as we wander through the technological world and get the advice we need, inform ourselves, and through open source, that's a philosophy which enables you to control the machine. And I suppose that's zeitgeist, really. I think people should think about that more. And as a blogger, as an entrepreneur, as an organizer, what fascinates you most? As an organizer, certainly the fact that you meet new people again and again without having to provide the input yourself, because you can offer a platform which gives other people a chance to exchange. I think that's really great. And if people say afterwards that they were inspired by something that you did, then that's great, that's fantastic. When I'm working as an entrepreneur, then I'm accountable only to myself. I decide how to use my time and which way I want to go and which people I'd rather not work with, perhaps. Perhaps that isn't true from day one, where you have to make a lot of compromises. Certainly, as time passes, you can. And now I wouldn't want it any other way. We try to, or at least in the company I work in, we have a very level hierarchy. And we work well together.
Aber wie funktioniert
even
dann
if
so
they're
eine
not involved in the company.
Ja, erstmal ist es ganz
How
viel
do you
Arbeit.
organise an
Also wir haben
event
ein
then?
riesiges Team. Wenn wir
Well,
jetzt
it's a lot of
als
work.
Beispiel nehmen,
We have a
arbeiten
team,
wir
of
mit einem kleinen
course.
Team das
If you look
ganze
at
Jahr daran. Das ist eine
Republica,
Handvoll
this
Leute.
event, it's a
Und
small team
als
working
der
all around the
Vorbeginn der
year.
Veranstaltung wird das Team halt immer größer.
6
Und
months
auf der
before the
Veranstaltung,
event
wenn alle
actually
Leute
starts, we expand the
mitzählt,
team.
werden wir sicherlich
And
zwischen
at the
500
event
und
itself, if you
700
count everyone, it's probably
Mitarbeiter
500 to
vor Ort,
700
Volunteers,
people
Leute, die uns halt unterstützen,
working on it. Some of them will
Leute,
be
die die Technik
volunteers,
aufbauen, Leute, die die
supporting
Speaker
us with their
betreuen. Wir haben
time,
alleine bei diesem
people
Event
putting the equipment
über
together,
500
people looking
Personen,
after
die als
speakers,
Referentinnen dort halt
because we
aktiv
have
sind. Das heißt,
over
jeder muss
500
abgesprochen
speakers
werden, jemand muss sich gekümmert
at the
werden.
event. And
Und
we have to
das
talk to them
können wir
all, we
natürlich
have to look
nur
after them all.
aus
Of course, you can only do
professionellen
that if you have a mix
aus
of
temporären Angestellten und
professional
Freiwillige, die eben dann
full-time
auch einen
staff,
Einblick in die Konferenz
temporary
und
staff,
bekommen.
and a lot
Das
of
ist so das eine. Man
volunteers
braucht also ganz
who
viel,
understand
viele Leute,
what's going on,
die
they understand the
auf der anderen
content.
Seite braucht man
So you've got a lot of power, a lot of
auch
people that you need to
Referenten
organize it,
kommen. Und das haben wir eben
but
geschaffen über
you need it
diese,
to be attractive so that the
digitale
speakers
Gesellschaft.
come, so that the
Und es
visitors
ist
come.
so, dass es sich
We've
entwickelt
done
hat
it
aus
with
einer
this theme of the
Blogger-Konferenz,
digital
einer
society.
Social-Media-Konferenz,
So it's developed
jetzt
from a
eine
blogger
Konferenz für digitale Gesellschaft.
conference
Das ist
to a
natürlich
media
sehr
conference
umfänglich. Das ist ja eigentlich alles,
to a
was es
conference
betrifft.
for digital
Daher ist es
society as a whole, which is very
Gesellschaftskonferenz, kann man
comprehensive.
sagen. Und dadurch
It's a
ist die
social
Bandbreite
conference,
sehr groß. Und
I think we can say, which
naja,
means
das
we have a
Ganze zu
big target
organisieren,
group.
braucht man natürlich auch starke Partner. Das heißt, wir haben immer einen
To organize all that, of course, you need strong
Sponsoren
partners.
und Funding,
So there's a
und den
balance between
Einnahmen durch die Eintritte der
sponsors,
Besucher,
funding,
sodass wir dann
and
einseitig
revenue
uns abhängig
from
machen von
selling tickets,
Institutionen oder von der
which
öffentlichen
means
Hand
that
oder
we're
so,
not
dass wir eben
unilaterally
auch frei und,
dependent on
emanzipiert
a
agieren
public
können,
or
ohne dass wir
private
Einschränkungen,
funder,
unterliegen,
which
die uns
gives us the freedom to
irgendein
make our
Partner
decision
halt,
making. We're not
halt,
constrained by
von
pressures
Platz
which we might be if we only had one powerful
Republica
partner.
hat als Bloggerveranstaltung angefangen, wie Sie gesagt
Republica
haben.
began as a
Aber Sie
blogger
sind
event,
auch
as you
selber ein
said.
Blogger. Das heißt, wie schreibt man dann
But
einen
you are a
Blog
blogger
regelmäßig?
yourself.
Wie
How do you
macht
write a
man das?
blog? How do you keep up with it regularly?
Da
Good
haben wir
question. I
andere
don't do
Teams, die
enough
das
of it.
intensiver machen. Also wir haben
We have other people in the team who do it a lot more regularly.
einen der wichtigsten Blogger
For
zu den Themen der
example,
digitalen Welt,
Markus
auch im
Bleckedahl,
Team und Mitgründer der Veranstaltung.
who's very good on organizing the
Das ist
digital
mittlerweile
world. He's on the
ein
team
Newsportal
of the
geworden. Das heißt,
co-founders.
auch da arbeiten halt viele Leute
It's
daran.
become a news
Ich mache
portal,
das mehr privat
and
als,
there are quite a few
Hobby. Ist
people
aber auch nicht
working on
schlimm,
that.
weil,
I
man
do
kann
my
sich
blog
einsetzen,
for a
wie man
private
möchte. Bei mir ist es halt so,
hobby, really,
wenn ich
which
Artikel
isn't
mal
bad.
schreiben
You know,
möchte,
I can use it when I want to.
mal ein
If I want to
bisschen
write an
tiefergehend,
article,
unterbringen, dann
if I want
mache
to
ich
go
das
into
dort.
more
Ansonsten
depth,
mache ich eher diese kurzen
then I
Geschichten,
do
das heißt,
that
also eben über Twitter oder über Facebook
rather than these
Inhalte zu
rather
teilen oder in
short-lived
diese Diskussionen
stories
zu gehen, weil es
through
einfach schneller geht.
Facebook or
So ein
social
Profil ist
media,
immer eine Menge Arbeit.
wanting to get a message across
Ihre
quickly.
Erfahrung jetzt so in verschiedenen Bereichen, was bedeutet Freiheit?
You have
Insbesondere
experience
jetzt
of
Freiheit im
very
Internet.
different areas. What does
Naja, zunächst mal,
freedom
dass man
mean in the
reflektiert
internet
und
now?
weiß, worum es überhaupt geht. Ja, das heißt, man muss
First of all, you
Technologie
need to think
verstehen.
about
Man muss
what do you
versuchen,
want it for. You need to understand the
Basismechanismen,
technology.
zu verstehen, wem gehört.
You need to
zum
understand the
Beispiel
basic mechanisms,
einfaches Beispiel.
like who
Ob es jetzt
owns
Apple ist
what,
oder
simple
Microsoft
example,
oder,
whether it's
oder,
Apple or
große
Microsoft
Teile auch
or
Google, haben wir Technologien, die
Google,
für den Unternehmen zur Verfügung gestellt
frequently.
werden mit ganz klaren
Technology is
Ideen
made
dahinter.
available
Das heißt,
by
eben mit
companies
einem
and they have a
Business
very
Case,
clear
mit
idea
dem
behind
Willen,
it. They
Leute
have a
auf die
business
Plattform
case.
zu binden.
They
Und das
want
würde ich als
to
unfrei
tie
bezeichnen.
people to their
Frei
platform,
im
and
Sinne
I would
von
regard that
Freiheit
as
wäre,
unfree.
ist Technologie, die eben keinem gehört.
Free in the sense of freedom
Die
is
Public
technology
Domain
that
ist, die
doesn't belong to
mit freien
anyone,
Lizenzen veröffentlicht
which is
ist,
perhaps in the public
wie,
domain,
Linux
which
oder freie
perhaps
Software, Open
is
Source Technologien.
distributed using
Gutes
free
Beispiel, was vielleicht
licenses,
jeder kennt,
like
ist,
open source technologies.
Firefox oder andere
One example that
Technologien,
perhaps
die im
everyone
Netz
knows
benutzt
is
werden,
Firefox
die
or other
eben
technologies which are
offenen,
used
Standards
on the
basieren.
net,
Und so kann man sehr schnell
which work
herausfinden für sich
using
selber,
open
eine
standards,
Technologie, die
so
offen
that
ist
you can
oder
very
nicht.
quickly find out, is this a
Wenn man ein
technology
bisschen
that's
tiefer
open or
gräbt,
isn't
dann geht's
it?
natürlich darum,
And if
wem
you dig a
gehören
bit deeper,
Infrastrukturen insgesamt. Das heißt
then it's
also,
about who
welche
does the
Macht
infrastructure
haben
belong
Provider, welche
to?
Macht haben staatliche
What power do
Institutionen
providers
und,
have?
wo,
What power do
sind halt die
public
Leute, die
agencies
bestimmen,
have?
wie das Ganze funktioniert. Das heißt,
And
also, es ist immer
where
ein,
do the people sit who decide
Kampf
how
und
all
eine
this is supposed to
Herangehensweise,
work?
für
It's always a
offene
battle
und freie Infrastrukturen, die eben nicht bestimmte
around
Unternehmen zum
open,
Beispiel
free
bevorzugen.
infrastructures
So kann man
that
eigentlich sagen, es ist halt verschiedene
are not going to
Schichten,
offer
und
preference to certain
Diskurse der
companies,
Freiheit
let's
gibt,
say. So there are different layers and
wie man
different
eben
discourses
Technologie
about
einsetzen kann. Und das, für
freedom
mich ist das eigentlich einer
and
der
about how you
zentralen
can use
Begriffe,
technology.
den ich aber verknüpfe
And to
mit
me, that's one of
Emanzipation,
the
mit
central social concepts which I would link with emancipation internationalism, equality. So we have a global community in the digital society which works with similar values and is an important factor, has an important power.
Wie kommt man ganz oben auf den Google-Seiten?
I'm sure a lot of people would like to know, how do you get to be top of the listings? Well, there are of course people who specialize in that. I wouldn't really worry about your ranking. These are technologies that are used by companies to achieve certain formations. I would not place my faith in rankings. They've got nothing to do with meaning. They're technological. If I offer good content, and if the work that I do is well known in the internet, then it'll happen by itself. We shouldn't confuse cause and effect. A search machine, a ranking, can only be... We shouldn't assume that is only the result of relevant behavior. If you're determined to get top of the ranking, then from my perspective, then your idea is already worthless, because you've given in to the dictatorship of the machine for something that perhaps isn't relevant to what you do. Matthias Dufner, that is the CEO of Axel Springer, the publishing company, wrote an article in a German newspaper last year, an open letter to Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google, recognizing that his company is completely dependent on Google. And he writes that he fears Google, and he's also scared that this may only be the beginning for the world of publishing and that may soon affect all other companies too. What do you think about this? Well, first of all, I think it's a fairly opportunistic maneuver. You say, okay, there's someone here at the moment who has a lot of power, certainly a lot more than I do. Otherwise, I'm sure if he was working for Google, he'd probably formulate the whole thing differently. So that's the first point I would make, that this is probably a corporate maneuver. It's about the positioning Axel Springer is trying to achieve in the transformation of a media company in the digital world. It's complicated. Of course, Axel Springer has done a lot in recent years, more than many others, but it's also a commercial move, and pointing the finger at someone else is perhaps trying to distract attention from his own digital power. But the third thing, and the most decisive thing, is why complain? You can do things. You can support technology that is free as a counterweight to these powerful companies. I can't see Mr. Dufner's commitment on that front. Berlin is the capital in Germany and Europe of open source technologies, and he could support this trend rather than investing in things that only serve his monetarist progress. So maybe he should be sweeping his own doorstep and thinking about which technology to invest in. What about the ones that are free or open to everybody? We are appealing for openness. But Eric Schmidt, Google, is now negotiating with the EU Commission and others for a special position so that they can be exempt from the usual competition rules that other companies have to deal with. So they're trying to find a way round the EU laws. Yeah, sure. I'm sure I'm not on Google's side. I'm just saying it doesn't make sense to point with a finger to the other company just because it's another company which is also powerful. I'm interested in the core mechanisms. I want a free and open internet. I want free and open structures. And I'm not concerned about which company is better or worse. These are core issues relating to the technology, and the core is the freedom, the ownership of the infrastructure. And you can't build a free network on the back of a company. It's a bit like in a sandpit. If Springer and Google are having a little tussle with each other, That is not the quintessence of the issue. Politicians need to understand how technology works. Often they don't. And as long as they don't, they will fall for the arguments of the lobbyists and the individual companies. It's important to understand how the structure is put together. Google is just a phenomenon of the zeitgeist if citizens, if ordinary people are able to understand where the problems are, what happens to their data, what they're prepared to hand over and what not. And if they understand how to live in the digital society, because what we're going through now is a transition phase. Everyone's got the technology, but they haven't learned how to use it. Anyone who grows up now doesn't know how else people used to live. But we need clear knowledge about how to manage the technology, the digital technology. Common sense, civil common sense hasn't quite got that far yet, doesn't really quite understand how it works. But it's a place where any age group, any kind, anyone with whatever education they have can discuss. Now, I don't know if what I've just said is the wisest thing in the world, but we are able to discuss these things. We can't simply say, oh, there's a danger caused by so-and-so. Of course, there is a danger of monopoly, no doubt about that. But this was a corporate maneuver, and I'd say, let's be cautious about that. That's interesting. But there's another position, of course, coming from the United States. Jaron Lanier, in his bestseller, Who Owns the Future, writes that we are both producers and consumers of data, of big data. So when we describe our habits or change our purchasing preferences, when we disclose those changes, then we are the ones who are filling Facebook and Google and so forth with content. So if it weren't for us, those big companies wouldn't exist anyway. So what he proposes to prevent a situation whereby Google, Facebook and Amazon become so big in a few years and the only companies in the world, he suggests that if we are users, we shouldn't pay anything, but when we're producing data, making it available, we should pay some kind of a transaction levy, a certain percentage, which means that smaller companies would have a chance and we would be working, if you like, as data workers. So he's suggesting trying to find a way to monetize this use of the internet, so that it's not just those big companies that are making a profit out of the data that we are placing on the net. What do you think? Well, it's a very fundamental philosophical question. I think it's naive. I don't think that's going to work in an open, free network, because for one thing it would mean direct intervention in the transaction of individual people in order to monetize them. Now, technologically, you could probably resolve that. That's quite possible. I don't know. I'm not really an expert in how to go about that. But I think if you look at the economic order in which we all live, it wouldn't work. It doesn't mean I'm in favor or against, but I don't think it's possible. If you were to go that way, discussing it as a vision of the future, fine. But it would not be possible in the economic order we live in. If we're going to talk about a different economic order, then you'll say, why bother with a transaction? Why bother with monetarizing it? We could just have a global, open, free internet, and then I don't have the problem at all. So that would be my three-stage response to that hypothesis. If you have such a visionary approach, and in Sao Paulo in Brazil, they're having a conference about the infrastructure, the web infrastructure of the future, so that it's not so focused on America, so that it's more global, more egalitarian, then I think I would want to discuss it along those lines, rather than hanging it on a business model which other companies have implemented. It could all work if there were a separate infrastructure for it. I don't think Google and all the others would be forced into doing it. All right, quite a trivial question, it sounds like anyway. But something which a lot of people talk about is, how does one recognize a good programmer? First of all, I think you recognize a good programmer because he doesn't promise you pie in the sky, but offers you a realistic assessment of what's possible and what isn't, and also good time management, because everyone knows what technology projects mean. Usually they take longer, they cost more money than they're supposed to, and they still don't function the way they're supposed to. A good programmer can assess very accurately what he can achieve in what time and doesn't promise you unreasonable things. Okay, let's come on to more general issues. How do ideas arise for companies? Well, firstly, you need a reasonable environment. You need the time, you need the opportunity to develop your ideas. I think it would be foolish to believe that you just come into a factory and you sit down and we urgently need an idea, so we'll have one. You need to develop experience, insights, and problem solving. A good idea for a technology is only going to be a good idea if it responds to a need that hasn't been responded to yet, or does it better. So an idea will have to build on something that already exists. So you need a proper analysis of the existing technology and enough scope to be able to develop it. You have started up a lot of companies in this field yourself. Which of them did you find most fun? Most fun? Well, I only did companies that were fun, so I can't really answer the question. Let's ask it another way. What was not fun was having to close things down after a year, because, as I said before, sometimes you have to learn from your mistakes, and we have to accept that sometimes things go wrong. And of course it's more fun if things work out and continue to work out several years later, and you can have an influence, make an impact with them. Then it's fun to see how things you wanted work, even if I'm not personally so involved anymore, because then I can pass things on. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen often enough, but... And what about the radius, your influence? Can you describe that? As our events, our projects, our conferences reach out further, that means we also have greater scope in our choices. We can have more influence on public discourses and the agenda, and I personally have to hand over management of one company. I'm looking for new ideas now. I'll have some time, some space to develop some new things. If you had a greater impact, what would you want to work on? Well, for a start, I'd look to see that knowledge about the digital world is much more available. There's a knowledge gap. Of course, all societies have had that, but how can we use our digital liberties? I think there's a lot to be done around enabling people to develop their own programs. Also, I would try to make sure that in this open, free, global infrastructure, we take this freedom for granted as we do oxygen for breathing. That's also important as an environment for companies. On the basis of philosophical and technological solutions, there is a lot we can develop. For example, the General Republic license for free software. Making these things accessible to all and enabling everyone to use them. That's very important, not only to the technological world, but also to society in general.
Was glauben Sie, wo Politiker
I would work for that.
Entrepreneurs noch mehr tun könnten?
What about politicians and entrepreneurs? What could they do that they haven't been doing? I think politicians have a very comfortable situation that they're in. They have a middleware layer of bureaucracy as a cushion. So as soon as you have power and influence, you have hundreds of thousands of people who are paid by the taxpayer to work for you. That's manifested, for example, in the way funding is handed out to companies. You have people working in the public sector paid by the taxpayer trying to support the commercial sector. I'd say that's a dead duck for a start, because if you've never run a company, how do you know how to develop the right infrastructure? Simply because you've got a big budget to spend, that's not the right motivation. So that would be a basic response. Politicians and the commercial sector need to work together in a new way. There needs to be support, more support for young, creative companies, but they need to have to be weaned off this institutional support. And there's always a tendency that they will be forced into a standard grid. So we have to rethink how we do technological innovation. There's a lot of scope there. If that's what we want to achieve, if we want people, whether they're young or old, men or women, to actually take things into their own hands and set up their own companies and projects, then they can't only be commercially oriented projects. If we're talking about social ownership or projects which are rather value-driven, not profit-driven, why don't we have billions to invest in those? And that's because the politicians don't really understand why it's important. You've told us a lot of interesting things. Can you tell us what is the most important for you? The most important is, of course, the question of the power balance in the digital world. Who controls the infrastructure? Who does it belong to? From my point of view, the most important question there is that the infrastructure should belong to everybody, that systems need to be developed to pursue that. And that's the main struggle at the beginning of the 21st century, that people can be emancipated from the machine again. What would you like to tell our users, the people who are perhaps listening to you, talking about ethics in the digital world? I don't think I'm the right person to tell people how to go about that. I'd say just do things. Jump over your own shoulder, jump over your own shadow, jump into the cold water. I was born in Cologne, and we've got a phrase there which suggests that anything will go well, because if things go wrong, you've learned from it. But you have to do it. You've got to do it. Last question. We always like to ask, what is the most important thing in life? Well, fun. Keep enjoying yourself and know that life can be over any minute. I can't put things off tomorrow. I have to keep at it. Okay, thank you. And enjoy Republica.